All right, people, focus up. Scott Wilson with Dumbass Contractors checking in with your daily briefing. Today's topic, compatibility. All right, a little bit of backstory. I didn't become aware of the concept of compatibility until later on in my career. I was in my late 40s, early 50s. Had a couple from here in Huntington, right down the street here, call me up. They needed to have their kitchen rebuilt and a couple bathrooms built. They were in their early 80s. You know, they'd been around the block a couple times. They obviously built some things before. I got to talking to the husband, and as we were specking out the contract and getting everything together, he said, "All right, now you're going to be responsible for compatibility." I said, "What's that?" He goes, "That's where I want all the parts to work together. All the pieces, all the systems, you're going to be responsible for that. I want you to write that in your contract." I've worked for a lot of heavy hitters in my career, masters of the universe, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. But this gentleman, Frank Elliott, was the heaviest hitter I ever worked for. He recently passed a couple months ago, but his legacy lives on with me. Frank had worked for Grumman Aircraft Corporation. He was a really smart guy, and he ended up being the head engineer on the lunar landing module. He had 1,200 engineers working for him. They built a lunar landing module that landed on the moon and brought two guys back up to the to Apollo. I think it was Apollo 8 or 9, somewhere around there, and brought them safely back to Earth. In being responsible for the design of that module and the compatibility of all the systems, Frank had introduced me to the concept of responsibility for compatibility. Frank also won the Presidential Medal of Freedom for Apollo 13, where they took the lunar landing module, turned it into a lifeboat, and brought 3 astronauts home from the moon without landing on the moon. Frank was a pretty smart guy. He told a lot of really great stories. One of my favorite stories of compatibility and systems working. He was working with Werner von Braun on the launch system from the surface of the moon. Frank was pretty intense. He was pretty intense all the way through. Doing even at 80, 84, he was still wound pretty tight. So he asked von Braun what happens when the module goes to take off, and Braun says there'll be a guillotine that will come through and cut the all the control cables for the landing system so that the module can take off. Frank said, "What happens if the guillotine doesn't work?" Von Braun says, "Well, then we have a secondary explosion that's going to just obliterate everything that's left if the guillotine doesn't come through and take it all." Frank says, "Well, what happens if that system fails?" "Well, then we have a tertiary explosion that just disintegrates the entire landing portion of the lunar landing module." Frank says, "What happens if that fails?" And von Braun looks at him and goes, "Look, something is going to happen." All right, that was Frank. Frank would take you to the mat, making sure that every T had been crossed, every I had been dotted, everything had been planned before we executed the project, before we started the project. Now, it turns out that as Frank's kitchen cabinets were delivered from Georgia, Frank told me that he could do this project himself, but it would probably take him a year to do it, and it would cost him a lot of money in wasted materials. He was handy, but he wasn't that handy, and he knew his limitations. So he's told me that he was hiring me for management and compatibility, and to make sure that the entire system worked together, and to be responsible for any glitches in the system that happened. Now, when the cabinets were delivered from Georgia, Yellow Freight was having some uh, negotiations with their union representatives. And from what I can gather, those discussions weren't going well. And the union forklift drivers were, I don't want to say that they were being reckless with the cargo, but we opened up our cabinets and it looked like somebody had bounced the whole pallet off a corner of a wall. Most of the cabinets doors had been shattered. Most of the cabinet frames had been shattered. Frank looks at me, smiles, and says, "Now you're going to earn your money." It was, I'm a cabinet maker, so we could make everything work. Or we had to order a couple replacement doors, but we re-glued everything back together and put out a really nice kitchen for Frank. And Frank and I became very good friends from that. Thereafter, he'd stop into my shop, wondering what we were working on. We'd see him around town. Just a lovely lesson in compatibility and systems. So now in all my contracts and when I'm sitting down with my clients, what I offer them is compatibility. I tell them that the dishwasher is going to work with the venting and the grounds are going to be put on all the electric work that we do. Sinks are going to drain. Switches are going to work. The entire system that we put together, from the bits and pieces, the different trades, everything is going to work together and going to function properly. And when I sit down with clients now, I talk about compatibility. Puts me light years ahead of my competition. They're just going to bring a refrigerator and some cabinets and throw it in the house. I'm sitting down talking to them. Yeah, you need somebody to make sure that all these systems work together. And it's very complicated. And if an electrical engineer that could build the lunar landing module with a slide rule realized that he needed somebody to help him out with making these systems compatible in a house that he'd lived in for 50 years, that tells you the complexity of what we're doing. Because Frank was still with it. Frank taught me this one too. The most important muscle to work out is your brain. After winning the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Frank never had to do anything again in his life. When they look back at Americans 2,000 years from now, they're going to say they were the first people to go to the moon and bring three guys back alive. And that's no small feat. And we did it 66 years after we learned how to fly. So in 66 years, we went from not being able to leave the ground to landing on the moon and bringing two people back from the surface of the moon. Frank was a big piece of that responsibility. And that's that kind of intellect. He never stopped. He never gave up. Every day, when he was in his 70s, he started doing tax returns. He'd go and do a tax course in October and November. And he had 5 or 6 guys that worked with him. They train up on what the new processes were for tax returns. And they go into Huntington Station and they do 1,000 tax returns for elderly and poor people. My favorite Frank Elliott story is one day he comes in, it's a July day, we're working in the kitchen. I mean, everyone's drenched in sweat. And Frank comes in about 2:00 in the afternoon. He says, "Well, I'm not doing that anymore." I go, "Yeah, what's that?" He goes, I'm not playing 18 holes of golf in 100-degree heat. I just can't do it anymore. This is an 84-year-old man. I said, "Oh, what are you going to do?" And I'm thinking, he's going to sit in the air conditioner. He goes, "I'm cutting back to 9. I'm only going to play 9 holes. If it's 100 degrees, I'm only going to play 9 holes. If it's only 90 degrees, I'll play the full 18. When I grow up, I want to be just like Frank Elliott. Exercise, brain, exercise your body, exercise your brain, exercise your spirit, maybe even go to the moon." All right. Little commercial here. I'm available for private one-on-one coaching sessions. I'll do a video response. I can do an email response if you've got a quick question that needs to be answered by email. If you think you have a question that the rest of the audience would like to have answered, or would help them out with the answer, I can do a video response, and I can do one-on-one coaching. All right, we're burning daylight. This is Scott Wilson with Dumbass Contractors, urging you to stay loose, stay relaxed. Most importantly, stay in front of it. Wilson out.